Okay, once again, good evening and good morning. I see it's 9 a.m. I think in Nigeria. I assume it's probably about the same in Nairobi, maybe a little bit later or earlier. Thanks again for coming along for the second week of the Internet of Things free short course presented by Charles Sturt and IT Masters, primarily by us at IT Masters, but we're in partnership with Charles Sturt University, which is based in central New South Wales. In fact, covers a whole lot of New South Wales. Before we get into the guts of tonight, let's talk about housekeeping. Feel free to chat amongst yourselves in the chat and tell us stuff that you might like to see. There's lots of good information coming up in the chat every time, and also in the discussion forums. They're available if you log into learn.itmasters.edu.au. There's plenty of stuff there. We had a quick look earlier in the week at the stuff that was around. In fact, I think it was Sean Townsend has posted a great little link to an article on security on the Internet of Things that we might refer to later on. And there's piles of information about that and lots of stuff going on. If you've got questions for us to answer live, and hopefully we can answer most of them. Usually there's more questions than we can answer in the course of the session. Then post them in the Q&A section. Make sure also that with the chat, your little blue button down there is pointed to everyone. Otherwise, only us as the hosts will see the chat, which is not going to help too much because we're probably not going to be able to chat too much while we're working. I see that Jeff is a little bit already, but I'm not very good at typing. So yeah, just tell us anything about yourselves while you're in the chat. You know, where you're coming from, what if you've got special interest in IoT, have you done some projects, you're thinking about it. And I'd also like to welcome our amazing moderator who is there as IT Masters. That's Lil tonight. Lil will be posting things in the chat and telling us which questions to answer. And Lil will make sure that we don't get off topic too much. So please give her a virtual round of applause. And once again, before we start, I'd like to acknowledge that we are webcasting tonight from Woiwurrung country, the lands of the Wurundjeri people, and I wish to acknowledge them as the traditional owners of this land. I'd also like to pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and to Aboriginal elders of other communities who may be here tonight as well. Now, on my virtual right, actually, tonight is Dr. Jeffrey Jenkins. As you know, Jeff is a tech guru when it comes to all things IoT and also an absolute whiz with ancient Aramaic and Syriac. My name is Shane Murphy, and I will take the lead in presenting this week, and Jeff will present the following 2 weeks primarily, which are much more on the detail of what's going on. So today's about what drives IoT take-up, next week's about device and communications, and then the week 4 is about big data and IoT applications. So it's very nice to be here, and welcome, Jeff. How are you?
Yes, I'm good, Shane. I back up your acknowledgement. Like to do that. Always like to hear it. I'm always a little bit amused when you say we won't be able to answer all your questions because we won't have time, rather than we won't be able to answer all your questions because we won't know the answers. But we will see how we go. We'll try.
Exactly. We will give it a shot. So this week is very much, in doing this course, we sort of had to think about things. We have a subject, ITC 560, which is presented by CSU and is a very good academic view of the Internet of Things, an overview subject. And we wanted to include some of the content from that or parallel to that, and at the same time take a slightly different tack, because as you may or may not be aware, IT Masters is very focused on presenting both an academic part of a subject and also a more business side of things. So we have many of our subjects are presented by people actually working in the industry. And it's no different with IoT. Both Jeff and I have long backgrounds in that and all the things that happened from before. So this week is a little bit more about the business side of it. And you might say, why would you bring this up rather than wait until we've done all the technical stuff? It's because it is the cart before the horse if you bring all the technical stuff up first. And we'll go into the reasons for that tonight in a little bit more detail. I can say in all my years of working in the field, which is about 20 to 25, I can say with some confidence that I've rarely seen an area in which so many people had such huge ideas of what was going to happen with so little evidentiary backing for them. And I'm sure Jeff's seen a lot of those as well. In fact, I know he has. Mostly it has been about a better way of doing something, and that has often been in the past technology driven. So we're trying to present this as being business driven in the first place, or problem solving driven rather than technology driven. The technology is the enabler to get the answers you want, not the reason for doing it in the first place. And so that's what we're going to do tonight. We're going to look at some good projects and the bad ones. We'll do a little bit of basic stuff around business cases, and we'll take a drive past some areas of concern in security and privacy, depending on how we go for time. As always, time is the demon that kills us. I thought we'd start off by just have a quick look, and sorry, my little clicker takes a while to click through, and just think about how big the Internet of Things is today. This is one of those graphs that I've been seeing since at least 2000, and they always look the same. They always go from the left to the right, and the left is down the bottom and the right's up the top. The question is whether the curve is more like a J sort of curve that goes up, or if it's a straight line, or if it's a hyperbola. And it always looks very bullish and buoyant. And it is interesting to note, as Jeff pointed out to me yesterday when we were talking through some of this stuff, this is about the point at which we've got real data to here. And interestingly enough, it always sort of kicks up on a slightly different angle once it gets past that point, because forecasts are always a little bit more bullish than the actuality. But when you look at it, you're looking at 23% and 18% compound annual growth rates, which is phenomenal in any industry. And that is the reality of the Internet of Things. We're talking about, at the moment, close to 16.7 billion units. That's more than 2 units for every person on the planet, as far as I can tell. But it's just not the same thing, is it, Jeff? There's, a unit's not a unit. What was it you were saying to me yesterday about that?
Oh, yes. When you see the word billions, you think that now that's worth paying attention to, but it's not billions of dollars, but billions of devices. So the growth in the number of IoT devices may not necessarily translate into a lot of money being made.
Sorry.
Go on.
I think you said something about, the more devices you got, often the more money you're losing.
Yes, well, that's certainly true. If you can't make money out of a single device, then you're not going to make much out of having millions of the things under your control. So that's really where these very large numbers we just have to be realistic about and make sure that we have sound business dynamics underlying it.
Yeah. It's also interesting to note that, there's 16 billion devices, but probably the vast majority of those are things like RFID tags, which are worth a few cents each and have no ongoing cost related to them. The cost of those is in the way they're deployed and what you do with the data that comes out of them. But I will say that the telecommunications companies in the mid-2000s got absolutely blinded by these sorts of things and threw bazillions of dollars into trying to chase down a market that was only ever going to give them $1 or $2 a month per device, when at the same time their average revenue on phone users was plummeting. So they thought it might be the savior, and it's not. But, it's just a very naughty boy, as they might say.
So Shane, a couple of observations to make, quick ones. That's a long period of time over which to see that sort of growth, and that's striking. And it's true of IoT that it's been going a while. It'll go a while longer, and there'll be strong increase in demand over that entire period. The other thing I would remember to say, if I could see the graphic, is that that we're dealing with. I wanted to draw attention to the connectivity type called other, which is fully a fifth of the amount of growth. And I suppose that's satellite, among other things. And we'll be talking a bit about satellite in the next while, but it'd be nice if if we observed it in this graph, and that's oddly enough goes from 21 down to 17. If it is satellite, then it doesn't. It'll go up higher in the next while because of new types of satellite. The other thing to say is a lot of the connectivity that we're talking about is hybrid. So in many of the projects that we'll be working on, if we work in IoT, multiple types of connectivity are involved in the project. So these are not separable into categories on their own. They're likely to be hybrids of local networks and cellular networks and the like.
I know we always talk about ubiquitous coverage, but it's actually a bit of a furphy. So I think we'll just start with what drives demand. And I'd like to talk a little bit about the core factors driving demand. And I've divided this sort of really into two areas, not this full complex list. And the reason for that is that basically anything to do with anything commercial, and even many government projects, are all driven ultimately by money, making money or saving money. And to be honest, saving money is the primary driver in most cases. Might not be saving money today or tomorrow, but it's saving money in the long term. And that we'll talk much more about in the next few slides. Efficiency and the ability to complete tasks at a sensible cost is the underlying driver. But making money has lots of devices out there too, but they're largely transactional. For example, FPOS, ATMs, parking meters, vending, and they largely work in low value per transaction terms. Even an ATM processing a withdrawal of $10,000 only charges a very small fee for that service. I mean, you may complain about the $2.50 that it charges you, but that's relatively small in relation to the amount of the product that it's selling, so to speak. So the number of transactions in those factors are key to success. And looked at another way, they are also a lot about saving money, because when we first looked at ATMs and the like, it was costing a fortune to process those transactions. And in fact, it wasn't viable. It used to be $10, $20 minimum to go and do an FPOS transaction. Nowadays, you buy your cup of coffee for $2 or $3 or $5, or $6 if you're in Melbourne. And there's no problem with that. Obviously, COVID's had a dramatic impact upon that, but it was heading there anyway. It's just accelerated what was happening. If you want an example about that, I was involved in the first Australian mobile FPOS project, which was back here in 1999, 2000. It was a clunky beast of a thing. As you can imagine, phones were huge in those days, and the FPOS machine was like this big. They were very expensive, $2,000 or more each. So people who wanted to use it usually wouldn't take one and buy it outright. They were mostly rented out on a daily basis. Worse, the cost of conducting a transaction was 50 cents or more, plus all the normal fees. And there were only a small number of gateways around that would enable you to sell into the financial networks in those days, and they all charge those sorts of rates. Doesn't sound like a lot of money until you want to sell hot dogs for $2 each. So that significantly impeded progress in the area. And later on, we'll talk a little bit about the things, in fact, in the next slide, about things that are actually driving progress in various areas. It was the combination of the new technology via Apple and Google Pay systems driving down transaction fees, plus just demand across the board, and the banks finally waking up to the fact that if they didn't do it, then non-bank financial providers would get around them. And also the efficiencies of having fewer branches and tellers. And that drove the cost down factor of it. And of course, as I said before, once you got COVID coming along, that nearly put the nail in the cash coffin. Nowadays, we're finding that banks are actually trying not to deliver cash to anybody unless it's a business that really needs it. And they're closing down branches again, as we all know. Certainly here in Australia, it may not be true in other places in the world. So if we were to divide the rest of the things into two, I would push all of the other things into a rough heading of government. Now, there's obviously going to be exceptions to this, but essentially government is about safety, it's about research, it's about health. Alarms and more up-to-date information saves lives and helps keep workers safe. A simple automated fire alarm means that the brigade will arrive within minutes of a fire starting, not much later after it has spread, to be visible from the exterior of a building. Often these are driven by government regulations, occupational health and safety, mandating things like enclosed spaces monitoring, for example. I don't know if you're aware of that, but if you go into what's a defined enclosed space, like a entrance to a sewer, then there are a lot of regulations about the gear you have to wear and have breathing apparatus and the like, because lots of people used to get killed in those things because the air was so bad, and they would, in fact, often be poisonous. Pure research is also obviously government dominated and funded in one way or another, no matter how many great things come from it commercially over time. As you may or not know, for example, the Australian government CSIRO organisation patented a product called Radiata in the early 1990s, and that became the basis for what we now know as Wi-Fi. It started out as a pure research project, and CSIRO saw some potential, but then large commercial firms created Wi-Fi later on based on that patent. CSIRO ended up suing people like Microsoft and a lot of the networking companies and cashed in to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars in royalties. Now, that's not specifically Wi-Fi, IoT, but Wi-Fi is a huge enabler technology for smart buildings, for example. Many IoT products go out via Wi-Fi. It's just one of the myriad of communications methods. And so it's similar with other research programs. They start off as pure research, and then they move into something more detailed over a period of time once somebody finds a different reason for it. In the same way that pure research often leads to those sort of applications, we had some minor involvement in an application that tracked the sounds that bat make. It actually tracked bat echoes. And that was great. Originally, it was a research project and they just wanted to measure the bats. Then what happened was there was a wind turbine farm going in somewhere near a bat area, bat environment, and they actually had to try and define the number of bats that were going to be damaged by the wind turbines. As you may or may not know, there's a lot of controversy over that over the years. And so what they did was they just recorded the sounds from the echoes using an IoT device, and they sent gigabytes of data in the days when usage was largely measured in bytes and kilobytes, by the way. They were paying $30, $40, $50 a month for a device. And it worked fantastically well. They were able to measure what was going on with the bats and provide evidence, which I think in the end enabled the wind farm to go ahead. Health is, of course, the other area in which government is intrinsically involved, particularly in countries like Australia. There are lots of health-related devices and projects around, many of them driven by government regulation and others by insurance too, which is sort of a way of saying government regulation, although it is, in one sense, one might say organised gambling. We might examine some more of these up ahead, but ideas such as communications-enabled pacemakers have been with us for a long time. We've seen a huge uptake in sleep apnea monitoring, as we spoke about last week. Air conditioning units are monitored under regulations for Legionnaire's disease in many countries, including here. In other areas, government regulation can be a shaper of IoT, for example, in privacy and security that we'll examine further ahead as well. And in Australia, motor insurance telematics products have been very slow to get off the ground, for example, because the laws around insurance prevent insurers from pricing differentially based on the way that people drive. So while the idea is great in theory, they can't actually use the information they get from the IoT devices in the way that might make more sense. So that's sort of, a bit of an introduction, but Jeff, g'day.
Yes, yeah, Shane, it occurs to me that that whole question of IoT and money is a different question in Africa from the question that it is here. And since we've got lots of colleagues joining us from Africa, we should address it, I think, as something that differs there and has its own virtues and designs in Africa, and particularly the whole way in which transactions are based on mobile phone accounts rather than on banking in countries where often people don't have bank accounts, but perfectly well transact. And there's so much person-to-person market as well. So it's something that we need to make explicit in our curriculum, I think. I wanted to say something quickly about government and the CSIRO. In defence of the CSIRO, in a way, they were very involved in the development of Wi-Fi, a lot of the technical work. In the end, the scientists who were involved lost their jobs and positions arising almost out of that very development. And the government clawed back from the CSIRO the amount of money that CSIRO made directly out of the patents. So CSIRO missed out because of that. And the actual scientists involved missed out too. And that's a reflection, a negative reflection on the way that research is funded in Australia, and it continues to be a problem.
I think that it also comes under the generic heading of failure is owned by one person, but success has many fathers.
Yes, indeed. Yeah.
Okay. Now, oh, sorry, it always takes 2 clicks to do that. Here's my little virtuous circle thing. Now, the idea of this is these are a little bit like we were talking about last week, in that there are economic systems or ecosystems and supply factors that enable demand and build upon each other and continue to build in a continuous virtuous loop. So, for example, until there was wide area, easily accessible public networks like GSM, CDMA, GPRS, etc., the hurdle to make a project successful was much, much higher. You're talking many tens of thousands of dollars to deploy radio networks, or wired networks, even much more. It means that universal or close to universal contactability and reporting and standardized device platforms, they all led to cheaper devices. And so again, the projects become more viable. It just keeps ratcheting downwards in terms of cost. And once cost ratchets down, then what's viable and what's envisageable, there's a word for the day, becomes a lot more, a lot wider and a lot broader. Of course, this doesn't represent accuracy at which point you siphon off the benefits, as it were. It's an input chart only. The point is the convergence of technologies had the happy coincidence over time and continues to enable growth in IoT applications in ways that just weren't possible before. For example, couriers. And I use this because this is a very basic thing. Couriers were one of the first people that were interested in dispatch systems, which is a small sub-branch of IoT. In the late 80s and early 90s, you saw the first in-van devices, little screens in the van with displays on them that were mainly in use in taxis and a very few high-end couriers. People like FedEx might have had them back in those days. They cost thousands of dollars. I'm talking Australian terms always, but you're talking about $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 each, and at least double or triple that in today's dollars. So there were considerable barriers to entry in an industry which was very much dominated by low margins. They also worked over two-way radio channels, so the range was limited, and there were distinct limits to how many devices could be accommodated on one radio channel, because if one was transmitting, the others couldn't. There was contention problems all the time. And that became a lot of infrastructure. One courier company I know of in Melbourne had something like 8 radio channels in order to run a data and voice successfully with only about 300 or 400 drivers. Updates to tracking, for example, were not so regular. There were all sorts of data saving strategies going on. Send a location with a job accept message and so on in order to minimize traffic volumes, and then actually compress the whole thing so you could get it down to, instead of a GPS string used to be about 144 characters, I think they got it down to about 15 or 16 characters in order to just get through, because that squirt on the radio was going to be, well, either money if it was across a phone network, or across radio, it's radio time. There were some programs around that did things like job planning, but mostly the dispatching was manual, as routing programs alone cost, again, tens of thousands of dollars and were at best helpful, but rarely definitive. Then as cellular became available, handheld units slowly became usable. They went from big boxes like that down to those ruggedized units that you've probably all seen on a courier at some point. Built to be dropped. They test dropping them from 1, 2, and 3 meters. They originally cost, again, over $2,000 each and had lots of limitations. They required a bit of training to operate. They're essentially small PEs using Windows CE or one of those other operating systems in a bulky box. The companies tended to buy them and build the systems or rent the whole package from a supplier. Coverage was also still a bit variable. Up until the mid-2000s, coverage was all over the place with many cellular networks. And that was dangerous in a minute-by-minute dynamic operation. For example, in 2010, Vodafone's well-publicised network jams and over-usages here in Australia cost us as a business thousands of users because they occasionally couldn't get messages delivered for 5 to 10 minutes in peak hour in Sydney, and that was unacceptable for their business. So you then got, as smartphones became more ubiquitous, due again to the decreasing cost of manufacture and increasing ability to process data, plus continuously improved data networks and big data apps and tools, the hardware component shifted from being a company responsibility to being that of the driver. So he starts using his personal device for somebody else's business operation. The companies would simply provide an app, and often they would charge the driver for providing the app as well. It allowed for much more accurate tracking because nobody cared about how much data they were using when it was, mere megabytes and they had gigabyte plans. And what we call sign on glass, where you sign for the delivery on the actual device, became viable and useful, as did pictures. So you could get rid of problems. It was misdelivered. Here's the picture of where it went. Oops, I've delivered it to the wrong house. So you've got this virtuous circle that kept spinning down and down and down over that period of time, from the sort of late 80s, 90s, all the way through to today. And everyone wins pretty much, except the people that make the old hardware, I would imagine. Are probably the only losers out of all of that, but most of them have migrated into new things. Do you have anything to add to that, Jeff, before we move on to the next bit?
Oh, I love this circle, Shane. I just shut my eyes and see it going round and round and round and round, and collecting huge amounts of data, which we've got to work out what to do with.
Yes. So if that's the ecosystem, what are the factors that then dribble out of that, would you say, at the end? It's the things, these are the sort of underlying factors that drive projects. The first one is what I call supply driven. And I think we should summarize this first up with, just because you can doesn't mean that you should. This is the argument that, oh, we can do this thing. This would be great. What a great idea. Let's do it. And so many people have tinkered with electronics, have come up with better ways to slice bread. And there's all sorts of problems with this that we'll continue to go into as we go along. But, the reasons why people might do these sorts of projects are they're curious about what's going on. They have a bit of an ego because they think they've got a great idea and want to push it through. They've got a gut feel that it'll actually really change the industry because they've read one article on Dell changing the computer industry 20 years ago and feel that they can do the same by doing an IoT app. They can feel inspired, and they can overall, I think the common problem is that people jump to the solution without defining the problem. And that's what's known as common sense. And that leaves out so many steps in the process. And in fact, in the business world, the operation that I used to work with, because we were the people that provided the communications to IoT. Hello, Richard, Leslie. Sorry, just saw somebody pop up in the group. The problem with it is that we became essentially de facto, what you call them, vulture capitalists, venture capitalists even. I'll be nice. We would get to see early stage applications and projects come to us all the time. Many inventors, for example, treated their projects like babies, but it was actually our job to assess whether they were viable or not, often because it meant that we had to invest a whole pile of time and effort in getting them connected and telling them how to do different things and defining processes for rollout in our systems. And that we then might get a return over time. So we invested up front, got our money back over a period of time. It meant that as a business, we became very accustomed to smelling out projects that had a business case and those that didn't. We looked to see if they had a in-depth process knowledge of the industry they were working in and building the app for. Could they define the cost benefits and so on? And build it and they will come has been and traditionally was the biggest single factor in determining both the commencement and the failure of IoT projects. Would you agree with that, Jeff? Is that still the case, in fact?
Oh, yes, it's absolutely the case. And it certainly was back in the day when a lot of these not so good ideas used to come from me and I used to suggest them to you, and you'd you were a bit disdainful, and I had to learn that there were other factors at work, like, for example, someone had already invented it ages ago and I just didn't know. I'd want to add one element to that, and that is frequently good ideas came from people who didn't really understand the technology at a deep level either. They didn't understand the market, but they didn't quite get the technology either. They were frequently non-programmers. Not that being able to program's that much of a virtue when you're determining the market, but there was really no virtue in some of these suggestions, and nothing innovative or new about them. But we did get good at picking them, didn't we, Shane?
Yes, and in fact, actually, that leads precisely into our first little case study vignette of the night. Some of you may have seen these. I tagged them onto last week's slides, but we'll actually examine a little bit here. This first case study is the supermarket bag crusher. The rationale behind this was to build small-scale plastic bag crushers that would produce raw stock suitable for plastic recycling pellets in each supermarket. So the idea would be, as you go into the supermarket, you would put your plastic bags in this machine. It would go crunch, crunch, crunch. It would spit out to you a little ticket that you could use in your local supermarket loyalty scheme. It would give you points towards something, discounts or other items, and everybody would win out of this. It was a recycling green product at a time when supermarkets were scrabbling around what to do about plastic bags. It gave them more people, more uses for their loyalty scheme, from which they make a lot of money. It was easy to use and service in theory. And in theory, it was known technology as well. And you would see that it was on the surface a no-brainer, except that nobody was applying any brains to it. In fact, the salesperson who was responsible for shepherding this project through was already planning his swimming pool and the size of it based on the amount of money he was going to earn from the thousands of these boxes they were going to sell. And of course, like the good old pet tracker, oops, where are we? It never happened. Why? Well, they never actually got a working module and product up. It was two known technologies, but they couldn't figure out how to put them together in any meaningful way at a reasonable cost and in a way that could be easily deployed. Nobody had ever built it before. They just was somebody that had something to do with the crushers, thought, oh yeah, we can connect them up. It's just a matter of programming. JMOP. It was never built. The concept was not welcomed by supermarkets as it was. They didn't want to spend the floor space on something like this. They were worried about the noise because there was a little bit of noise in theory from the devices, and it was unproven. So they wanted like a pilot with 50 units before they were going to go anywhere near it. And in fact, this is one of the classic cases that I think demonstrates the lead balloon rule of IoT failure. Build it and they won't come. And I've seen many, many more of those. In fact, as I said last week about the sleep apnea devices, they were one of the very few devices that came to us and said, we think there's 1,000 and then sold nearly 1 million. Most people come and say, we think there's 1 million and sell 5. And that has been the history of IoT in many respects for many years. So if we move on.
Just before we do, Shane, I notice Sue and perhaps others, Sue B in the chat, mentioning that this supermarkets and plastic bag recycling has come to life and then died again in the last year. I think around Australia, but certainly in Victoria, died perhaps for a different reason. The technology, the process now exists, but there's a failure in the cycle at the point of using the end product. But for whatever reason, these things are flashes in the pan. They seem like a great idea. They are a solution to a recognized problem, but they're not thought through and they don't hang together.
And now, as Shane said, we're back to paying 25 cents for brown paper bags, which we used to get for free in the 70s and 80s, I would imagine.
Indeed.
So the real guts, though, the thing second to being supply driven is productivity. And as I said before, it's all about money, either making money or saving money. And productivity is about saving money. It's the real driving source of most successful implementations, certainly in the industrial sphere, or what we would call the IIoT, or more sort of business-oriented applications. Whether that be monitoring machines so that they can be better maintained and break down less catastrophically, replacing people doing meter reading so that can be done every day or even in near real time, or spotting aberrant behavior in machines or people. E.g., and here's some more, truck tracking stories, because there was a lot of truck tracking done in the early days, so they're a little bit exaggerated. There was one large company that did a trial of truck tracking around and found that one of their drivers was going 600 kilometers every day out of his way to see his girlfriend, and was doing that on the company's petrol or diesel, in fact. Another one did not believe in truck tracking at all, didn't think it would help them at all, because their trucks just went from Melbourne to Sydney and Melbourne to Sydney and back and forth, and they knew the route, and why do we need to track them? Nothing ever happened. But they agreed to a pilot anyway because they wanted to be seen to be doing something, and that is often the way that these things start. People want to be seen to be doing something, wanting to act rather than wanting to actually do something and make a change. And they compared our results with the in-vehicle logging systems that most trucks have, their add-ons, but were widely accepted for logbook records. Our results showed, as a GPS system, that the driver drove 100 kilometers at the speed limit, and then he stopped in a side street in a country town for 20 minutes, and then he sped at about 130 kilometers an hour for about 250 kilometers, stopped at a cafe for about 30 minutes, then sped again for another 300 kilometers, then stopped again for 20 minutes in another country town, and cruised into the destination at the speed limit. His in-vehicle logger said that he drove at the speed limit all the way. I went in to see the people, and they said, "See, your stuff is rubbish," they said. And we went, that's interesting. Let's think about that. And we posed it back to them in a slightly different way. What if their driver had driven at the speed limit to the town, the country town on the way out, and then applied a patch or a hot wire, I think they called it in the day, to the vehicle logger, which were widely known about, and that changed the way that the logger registered the speed, because the speed was registered off the gearbox, and it was related to the number of cogs or the number of turns of the cog that went by. And they would just change that effectively. Then he would just drive fast because he wanted to drive fast, and he would stop. Why did he stop in the town? Well, it turned out that he was stopping just inside a set of cameras that have been installed by the government called Safety Cam. And the Safety Cam cameras are designed to get around people avoiding speed cameras by tracking their average speed over a distance of several hundred kilometers, I think it is. So this way, by being past the first camera, he could take a break for half an hour, and he could speed to his heart's content, because the other thing at the other end wouldn't pick up his aberration in speed. They just pick up that he was, below normal speed, in fact. And then, of course, he got to the final country town, and he had to remove the patch from the logger because it wasn't his truck, and then just cruise into Sydney at the right speed. They said, that's just far too complex. That's rubbish. This GPS stuff, it's all garbage. It's too complex. Why would he do that? But they agreed to ask the driver, and sure enough, he eventually admitted that that's what he'd been doing. And they asked him why, and he said, "I like to drive fast. I want to have coffee with my mates." So getting him to go at the speed limit lessened their risk of infringements, which would have caused problems for the whole company if they were getting it all the time. It reduced the possibility of accidents, reduced their fuel costs, and gave them more compliant, better drivers over time that didn't push the trucks to the limit. So in the end, it was an efficiency thing. You could say it's about arresting bad behavior, but actually it's about productivity. And that's on the most boring trip you can possibly imagine. It's like being on a rail line, Melbourne, Sydney, depot to depot, nothing happens on the way. Lots of applications, of course, cross over several reasons, e.g. mine loaders that operate remotely underground. They're often more efficient and effective as the shifts can be swapped more quickly and easily. They can work a little bit faster, and they're a lot. They don't have to stop at all. They're much safer for drivers, of course, because the air quality down in those pits is often very unsafe because they don't pipe in fresh air into those when they're first digging them out. And they assure that everything is efficient. So you've got safety and efficiency. And safety comes up later as one of the things. That's why overall I've usually said that business cases are about saving money, saving lives, or any income streams. And they also change things by allowing us to do things that we could previously not do sensibly or at all, e.g. daily reads of various devices. So the next one is about collecting data for enhanced insights. And this is about things that don't have a direct relationship that's really there between what the data they collect and the results that they're used by. It's more about collecting the data, and then that data is used by different people for different things. And weather is probably one of the prime examples of this. Once you've got the weather collected, then that has effects on everybody. Or, for example, they vary from, understanding the migratory patterns of various birds or fish or mammals, which can often be linked to efforts to save them from extinction, for example. Or in the case of sharks, can help keep them away from humans, in theory. To the obvious benefits of weather forecasting, which does lead to real-world financial returns if bad storms and events can be predicted and prepared for. Flood warnings can be in place, for example, as river levels rise and are real-time monitored. Even the firefighters down in Gippsland this week would have known almost to the half hour or 20 minutes as to when the rain front was going to come over and put out the fires and save them all. And they knew that's what kept them going when a town was being threatened, because they knew then that the weather was coming. Well, of course, they can also be doing things like monitoring river levels as the floods come through. Seismic sensors also tell us about earthquakes, although they're very inexact really about predicting new ones, but they can certainly help us prepare for things like tidal waves and give us a little bit of early warning. But Jeff, you had a good example about winemaking, I think, with this.
Yeah, yes, Shane. I think ground monitoring in vineyards to detect the amount of moisture, and in fact to do it on a micro scale, so that for each vine you can get a readout of the amount of moisture in the ground, and you can allow that to control the irrigation systems so that it all becomes automatic. You get as much irrigation as you need, and all of that feeds into data that are compared in the season with the sort of grapes that you get on the sort of occasions when you harvest them. And so that's all the sort of granular information that IoT can provide, which otherwise would never have been possible to get, so that the person running a vineyard had a vague idea about it based on rain more than anything else, and the sort of vintage. But this is terrific. But it does remind us that when IoT can now do things that were never done before, it can be hard to price it because those things weren't done before. And so its value is sometimes lost sight of.
In some ways, in that particular example, it's about replacing years of experience with systems that just work and function. And so doesn't become centered around one person's insights.
Yep.
So the next sort of category, if you like, is real-time monitoring in apps. Alarms, and I've said efficiencies here again, but it's more about dispatching, about moving the vehicles around in the most possibly effective manner, and also for preventative reasons. So it really depends on, there's lots of applications that depend upon being as real-time as possible. Fire alarms, obviously, as we spoke about before. Personal health alarms and applications where somebody presses a button, you want that answered immediately. And that feeds very much into how you build your application and the sort of costs you're prepared to pay for it. Because on one hand, personal alarms, nobody really wants to pay a lot of money for, but at the same time, they want to make sure that they are working absolutely 100% efficiently. It's all about the prevention of major problems from unexpected events and minimizing the cost from them in terms of lives and money. But on a more prosaic level, it's also about slightly less critical applications, e.g., the famous, or infamous as it is, pet tracker. The pet tracker is one of those applications, and this one did belong in the category of build it and they will come, and continues to belong there as far as I can tell. The idea is you put a tracker on your pet and your pet doesn't get lost. It's really simple. It seems easy on the surface. We've got lots of stuff that should make it work. There's generally two types of these sorts of devices, and there's been dozens and dozens of attempts at getting them right. The ones that are really good, like this one on here, they have a GPS tile tracker on the pet. It's on a collar and it stays on. It gets recharged regularly and it gives very accurate applications. They can put zones around it and all sorts of stuff. That's one of them. The other is more like the Apple Tile. Is it the Apple Tile? The Apple, the little things you can get, which is essentially an RFID device that works in a small area of a few hundred meters around your home. And so obviously there's relevant parameters to these that limit or define the way it's going to work. It's the power usage of the device. It's the amount of times it has to communicate. It's how robust it is. If the pet drives into the river, is it going to get wet? Is there anything going to be a problem? And it's the cost. And they're all critical factors. And I've seen lots of devices that on the surface seem to meet all of those needs. However, as you would assume from the way I've been talking about it, they don't really work that well. So far as I know, while a number of people have sold, literally a few thousand of these over a long period of time, maybe, in the end, they all fail just usually at the point at which you want to use them. The good ones that drain a fair bit of power, you have to actually charge the batteries regularly. That's a big problem because you've got to take it off the pet, remember to put it on every day, and it's always the day that you forget to put it back on or forget to recharge it that the pet goes missing. The coverage of the local system ones ends too soon. So you might get an alarm saying that they've gone outside the area, but then you've got to get home and you've not got very much time to do that, and you can't track the pet once it's outside the area. You might be able to track it as it comes into other islands because some of them use Bluetooth off other people's phones, but that's very hit and miss as well. The alarms, it's very hard to get people who are pet owners to set up a good system of how the alarms work. So can they actually define the areas where they want to know where there's something going on? Can they actually manage the application? Can they have it on their phone, etc.? And then you've got cost. You can get the devices themselves down to a couple of $100 or even less for a cheap one, but then you've got to pay a communications cost for the good ones. And are people willing to pay $10 a month or more to not lose their pet? It's a bit like insurance. The reality is that hasn't been proven. There are very few people that, when it comes down to it, are prepared to pay, $50 or $120 a year for the purpose of that. So ultimately, it has no business model that makes sense because nobody knows how to follow the money. If, for example, it became part of an insurance company, the way to sell a pet tracker would be to sell it to an insurance company and then have the insurance company require it as part of their deal for having pet insurance. It would get swallowed up in the insurance fee that they pay, $300 or $400 a year or whatever it is, and everybody would walk away and be happy, a bit like the sleep apnea one. But thus far, nobody has come up with that business model. And so without any business model and without any defined solutions to these sorts of problems, it's been a complete and utter dud. And a lot of people have spent a lot of time, a lot of money designing really nice products that would, in theory, make sense, but don't seem to. And I can see that there's conversations going on about, recharging systems like watches and the like. I don't think they have enough power, for example, to power GSM or a 5G module continuously in the amount that you need it to do, because it's got to have some intelligence in it. It goes back also to the intelligence of the devices. If the device has no intelligence, it has to have very good communications, because as soon as it's out of communications, you can't do anything with the data. It has to keep sending the data off to somewhere else that'll have the intelligence. And for example, to say, oh, it's gone outside the zone, I need to do something about that. Okay.
We lost a cat, but the cat certainly wouldn't have been willing to wear a collar, so there was no way to to deal with that. Shane, I wanted to jump back for a second
Mm-hmm.
to designing airports. But when we come back to you, you might like to reflect for a moment on the relationship between pet tracking and COVID tracking, because there is a connection there. I know a bit about designing airports these days because I have a son-in-law who's an airport designer, and I've learned a lot. One of the things that's really intrigued me is how much data is collected on spec by people who put monitors in where they think someone might want to build an airport, like Badgerys Weir or Creek or whatever it is in Sydney, measuring wind direction and wind speed, because it's so important for the design of an airport, how you orient the runways. And my son-in-law tells me that with climate change, our runways are gradually becoming less optimally oriented. And so if you're building a new runway, you want 10 years worth of data on wind speed and direction. So I find that particularly intriguing as an example of anticipating the need of a data set and providing it.
It's it also comes up later in some ways, even though there's no specific privacy things about that. But we'll talk about privacy and data collection a little bit later on as well. So now we're back to
Talk about
earning.
COVID, Shane.
Oh yes, tell me about COVID.
Oh well, I thought you might, but we know that somebody made a lot of money out of a COVID tracker. It was a Bluetooth device that interacted with somebody else's Bluetooth device, although it seemed never to do it, and would report that information to the government. And I think they might have paid a couple of $100 million for it, and got about 10 reports over a couple of years of COVID. So that was one where somebody made a lot of money, but to stick with a theme, the design was a dog.
Yes, as always, the design is critical, and building a better or cutting a better slice of bread is actually very important, and you can understand why people, once they've come up with what they think is a great idea, can see the value in it. It's just getting all the rest of the stuff right. So if we're going back to earning revenue via transactions, which is I say it's small, but it is significant. It's just that it tends to be concentrated in a number of very defined areas earning revenue. And earning a ticket clip has become a significant income stream for many IoT applications. Parking and vending machines were one of the first to use it. Having real-time parking meters, for example, with payment on site allows not only for more efficient collecting of revenue, it can also allow for differential time costs. You could charge more for a car park in the peak hours of the day and less off-peak to drive city efficiency, as well as fill councils' coffers, or to, in fact, guide behaviour in similar ways to the ways that they're reducing parking around the city now in general in order to stop people driving in. ATMs and FPOS were also early adopters of IoT technology. It's getting to the point now where many banks are minimizing their cash availability, as we know. But it's also created habits and new ways of accepting payments that we are used to and want to keep. The cost limit on FPOS transactions has come right down now. And ATMs, the ones that you see in coffee shops and petrol stations, most of those have a modem in and a over-the-air wireless via cellular system of some sort. Some are fixed wired. The bank ones tend to be wired because they spend a lot of money on them. But the other ones nearly all operate over the air now and use IoT technologies for that. And that has its own challenges in terms of they're one of the few applications in which security and encryption and all that has always been first class because they were such tempting targets. In some ways, they aren't traditional IoT, but they've come to dominate much of commerce. And as I was saying above, the availability of, for example, Apple and Google wallets has meant huge income streams to those two companies, and they clip the tickets along the way as well. And as well as that providing massively improved convenience for us as users. And it's just enabled things that weren't possible before. If it wasn't possible to buy, a $2 or $1 chocolate bar using your phone in the past, that meant that often that sale wouldn't have gone through. Whereas now it does, and everybody gets a little bit of money out along the way. And it has completely changed the way that we view commerce and ATMs and FPOS type solutions because of the ubiquity of those devices now. You look like you want to say something, Jeff.
I'm busy typing here and enjoying the conversation, Shane. I wanted to mention that I was in Sydney last week, and I used a parking system I'd never seen before. It was as well I've got a PhD, because otherwise I couldn't have worked out how to do it. But it differed a little bit from the one in Melbourne, in that in the road were Bluetooth sensors, which detected the moment that you parked in the space, and then communicated that information direct to the meter. So you would wander. I parked for half an hour, wandered down to register my presence and pay, and it would only give me an hour out of the 2, because it detected I'd been there for an hour already.
Oops.
So those sorts of enhancements of the use of networks and comms are all around us. Next thing will be satellite detected parking overstays.
Yes, with your number plate on the roof.
Yep.
It is actually interesting, that sort of stuff. I've heard of that technology. In fact, I thought they were trialing it about 10 years ago. It's the same. It's not dissimilar to the stuff they also use in supermarket car parks, where they tell you where all the bays are free. That's another IoT application, which is very simple but very useful for people who want to actually get the output, which is knowing where their car parks are free. So the last of the sort of overriding categories, if you want, is legislation, as I was referring to before under the government heading. LAW, law. Safety laws, health laws or compliance with insurers, as with the CPAP case study. Laws governing utilities and what they can and can't do. Pollution laws, being able to monitor the amount of pollution that goes into a river out of a factory and do that remotely. It's required by the environment protection agencies in most countries these days. Parking, as we discussed. Offender monitoring is another part of legal requirements. And these all drive IoT projects in all sorts of different ways, often because the only or by far most effective way of meeting the requirements is via remote monitoring or applications. For example, the pollution one, if we were dependent on the sampling the things every few days or every few months by sending somebody out there, the cost of that is onerous. The results are always behind time, and you can't do anything about it once a big spill's happened other than find somebody. The idea about this would be detect, as well as finding people, it's about detecting things looking like they're going bad and using that data to actually create an environment in which you can be proactive and solve problems before they become catastrophic. I can't emphasize enough about how solving problems before they become major issues is an unspoken driver behind so many of these applications. And somebody was talking about electricity metering on the chat, and this is the time at which we start talking about that. So I'm going to talk about one part of electricity metering. This is one of the early ones. Obviously, since then, electricity metering, certainly in Victoria and in other parts of Australia and many places around the world, has spread out to everybody's house. But in the beginning, and this is back in the late 1990s, there was what they called the contestable market. They started to open the electricity meter market up nationally to large buildings that had very large usage. I think it was like 750 kilowatt hours or something. And they decided in order to make that work, they needed daily billing reads, and they would then take that data and send it into the central data exchange, because you had differences between the people who actually provided the power, the people that built the power, the people that built the networks, and the people that provided the metering. In fact, they're all 3 or 4 different organizations often. So the parameters for this were that it was legislation or regulation driven, because the national electricity market had just been set up, and they decided that if they were going to allow people to bid on other people's electricity, then they needed to have a defined and regulated market for that. It requires a very high level of consistency and reliability, and there were significant legal consequences if you missed reading the meters for several days in a row, for example. It was a relatively high cost of the rollout, because if these companies were competing for the business of large companies, say a supermarket, set of supermarkets, in those days, one of the big supermarket chains had, I think, 113 supermarkets in the state of Victoria, and they wanted to change their electricity supplier over because they're going to save a few cents per kilowatt hour about it. And that required them to actually put new meters into every one of those supermarkets, which was an expensive operation at the time. But they also needed to have low ongoing costs, because they weren't really making a lot of margin out of this. Those big users got very cheap prices. They needed to be able to collect the data efficiently and make it work. And at the same time, it was in the background of, there was a global push on this sort of thing. It was seen as best practice in the world. And it was in the, I suppose, that the realms of, let's make everything that used to be a utility competitive. This is the only way we can actually have competitive in something, rather than have 2 wires into every building so that the different people can supply on it. We just have 1 wire, and we compete at the level of billing, for example. So was this successful? Well, yes, it was hugely successful, and it drove competitive metering, and in fact laid the groundwork for the stuff that's gone into every home now. But it was basically successful because it was a legal requirement. They had to find a way to do it. Because they had to find a way to do it, then all of the other things became problems to solve that got defined. Utilities are full of great project engineers and electrical engineers that actually know what they're doing, and they're used to working in situations where everything has to be critically reliable, because as soon as the power goes out, there's major problems. And they were thorough in how they managed all the processes. So this wasn't just a few people throwing an idea, throwing some mud at the wall and make it stick. This is a mandated change with a lot of engineering and project things behind it. In terms of cost benefit, probably cost them a lot of money in the first few years, but actually stayed in place for a long time. Those meters that rolled out in 1999, 2000, for example, and started with what they called GSM dial-up. So they would actually have enormous telephone switches that would dial up every night 10, 20, 30,000 phones out in the field and download the usage data for the day. I think it was about a 20-second phone call, and they would get charged phone call rates for those calls back in those days. And in fact, a lot of those were still in place right up until the time that the GSM network was switched off, which was, what year was that, Jeff? 2015, 16,
yes, yeah,
something
more or
like
less.
that. Yeah, so 16 years or so they were in place for, and just never missed a beat. Apart from, every now and again there were problems like the ones we spoke about last week, where the devices would think that they were there and the network would think that they weren't. But they solved all of those problems because they had engineers that actually piloted, made it work, kept going. And so it was, legality drove things. And now, of course, it's become smart meters in everybody's home, where you can get your apps and you can see on the app, oh, that's how much usage I was. Oh, what's happened? Oh, I've left the heater on all day. And people were actually starting to respond to those sorts of cues much more. Somebody I know has solar panels on their house, and they look every day to see if they've saved money and how much extra data they can use. Sorry, Jeff, did you have anything to say about the electricity case study?
Only that one of my customers in my day job is doing exactly that with updated technology to this day, and very successfully, dialing out every night, collecting data and processing it.
And they're an independent third party. They're not actually a utility, are they?
No.
They're a supplier to the utility companies.
Absolutely. They're in a bit of strife because one of their competitors has done a deal with the utilities and is cutting them now out of that market. But it lasted for a long time.
Yes, they were one of the first. I know who you're talking about. They were one of the first people in the market in the early 2000s. I remember speaking to them in those days. And as Martin has said in the chat, it did allow, in theory, time of use plans that could be used to influence consumption patterns and peak consumption. Certainly smart meters in home ones, and they've been doing that in South Australia for many years. I think they were hardwiring in the first place, particularly in South Australia, the ability to remotely turn off people's air conditioners. I know that people were talking about that in one of the forums as something that was possible, but I think they've been doing it in parts of South Australia for a long time because that tends to have been the state that gets closest to having brownouts most regularly because of the heavy demand from air conditioners that goes on and off. So yeah. I thought we'd probably just go on and, sorry, my mouse I can't see, so I'm trying to skip to the next slide. There we go. And talk a little bit about IoT business cases. And there's a reason that we do this, and it's this. That's the theme. Follow the money. One of the things I like about the Internet of Things as a subject area, I mean, IT Masters has a lot of subject areas. We deal with cybersecurity, cloud computing, networking, all sorts of things, is that the Internet of Things actually takes little bits from all of those disciplines and combines them into an application side of things. So in this case, this slide is really, in some respects, project management 101, you would think. But so often it's the way in which business cases fail. It's the way in which applications fail because people don't do their homework and their diligence in this. As Jeff was saying to me the other night, don't start at the end. You know, this is, you actually have to start at the beginning with these things. And if you don't do that, then that's why IoT projects fail and fail and fail and fail. The first thing is, and it's bleedingly obvious, and I apologize that this slide is all about the bleedingly obvious, it seems, but you know, it's the bleedingly obvious that we all overlook. Assess the business problem. What is the business problem? It's costing me too much money to monitor my machines because, you know, I can't get enough people out there to do it during the day. They fall asleep. You know, it's just not making sense for me. I need to find a cheaper way to do that, or a more effective way that's going to tell me minute by minute what's going on with the machinery, on which I've spent many hundreds of thousands of dollars for my factory, for example. So so you define what the cost is that you're going to solve and the problem that you're going to solve. You get statistics to back what you think is going on. You do some piloting and try it. And then you start thinking about what is available in the marketplace to do it. You know, do people have end-to-end solutions already? Because the reality is the overwhelming majority of IoT projects and products can be as simple as a data collection device, a modem, a server, and an application, a database, and an application that overlies the database and extracts the relevant data. Now, that means that most really good applications can be modified to suit many, many different ends. And there are a lot of people out there that do that sort of stuff. And it's just a question of what are the sensors, what are the edge devices that you need to do? And then, you know, what are the outputs you need? And we'll talk more about that, I think, in coming weeks as well. You know, what's the answer you need to get out of it? And as Stephen says, yes, you do check and see if there's a product in the market first, and you test that as well. But you also look at what other people have got, what they can modify if it doesn't exactly suit your application. And it often helps if you're in the position that you know the industry really well and you're working hard in the industry itself. That means generally that what you do know is you know the industry's problems and you can define them because they've been there for years. even if people have been ignoring them for years because that's just the way things are, you can often see different insights once you start looking at it through an IoT lens. And I've got down here, buy, don't build, for that reason, because the longer it takes you to build, the more difficult it is to get the project through. We've all seen headlines about government things. And I'm just going to say a little, by the way, just leave the questions open for a little while. We've got plenty of space in the questions, so maybe we can give them another sort of 5-10 minutes on the questions. And I'd encourage people to ask questions so that we've got a bit of time to answer them. We normally shut them bang on 8 o'clock, but looks like there's a bit of space there tonight. But yes, buy, don't build. If you can possibly avoid building a product from the ground up, don't do it. It really is the way to spend a whole lot of money and a whole lot of heartache. It stretches out the things, even if you're an actual expert in the field. Get buy-in from the process owners, because often that is the thing that'll stop you. People will say, yeah, we want to do it, but they don't really, and they won't actively participate. And if they actively participate, then be prepared to do the full implementation to the full extent when you actually get to it, because that's when you get the results. And that's after you've piloted, tested, trialed relentlessly. And that are basically the keys to it. There's a whole lot more stuff in between it. There's, you start to figure out where you store your data. You think about costs. You think about ongoing costs. You have to make all sorts of decisions. Myriads and myriads of decisions have to be taken along the way. Is how much data do you want to send? When do you want to send it? Why do you want to send it? What do you want to collect? What are you going to do with the data in the long term? It's all very well to collect 1 million tracking points from a vehicle tracking system, but which ones are important? How are you going to know which ones are important? They're the decisions and the thinking processes that go into designing a proper IoT application. There's so much stuff out there that you can do, and lots of it is already done, as people are saying. You don't have to keep reinventing the wheel, which lots of people want to do. All you have to do is to be able to put bits together at the very worst in most cases these days. When you have a truly unique product, sure, that's what you do. But then usually that's a large company. You've been involved in many an IoT business case, Jeff. What's your take on this?
Oh, yes, Shane, and there's a lovely dynamic here, isn't there? If you build, then you won't test, is my rule of thumb, because the critical thing is the time. You can't really be the fifth product onto the market in these spaces, because pretty much the market will be gobbled up by the first product, and then you'll just be competing for crumbs. So speed to market is so critical, which is why you don't want to do a whole lot of development for yourself if you can possibly avoid it. But then, because of that obligation, people will build, but then they won't test, and their product will be a flop, because of the pressure of time, and that sharp end of competition. So yeah, I think that's a lovely way to describe it. But I reiterate the point you mentioned, Shane, which is start with an assessment of the business problem. Don't skip that step. It's a recipe for heartache if you do.
Absolutely. And although I would challenge that the first person is the one that collects all the crumbs, often it's the second or third, because they've learned from the mistakes of the first people, because often, the bleeding edge is the bleeding edge for that reason. And if you can be number 2 and number 3 into a market, that's a really nice place to be, because you can see some of the things that need to be done, and you can see how to do it better, and you can price it better, and all of the other things kinks are ironed out to a certain extent. And actually, Ros made an interesting comment in the chat, and I'll leave you all to do that. I don't need to read it out, but I think that's a good point to it. Now, we've got a little bit of time left to talk about security and privacy, and I think I'll just do a little brief introduction, but I think this is really more your area than mine, Jeff. And Sean, as I said, had shared a link, which I will bung back into the chat later on. And I think Sean actually did earlier. That's from the forum. But essentially, where this came from is that most Internet of Things applications back in the radio days, they were all private. They were done by private people. They were sending a few ones and zeros, and the idea of security just didn't occur much. They were all bespoke devices, so nobody knew what the ones and zeros meant. It was over two-way radio, which, yes, you could hear the things going squirt, but nobody really had much interest in them. To a large extent, that's still the attitude of many users today. They depend on the inbuilt security that's in phone networks, for example, GSM, 3G, and the rest all have very good encryption standards. So the over-the-air component is actually reasonably well secured. Obviously, there are people that have cracked it at various times, but in principle, it's as secure as you would expect for an over wireless network. And then the fact that they use a VPN usually to gain access to the data storage, again, limits the damage. But often, end devices are connected via other means as well, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, etc., that have known exploitable vulnerabilities. End devices are often too stupid to properly encrypt anything because they've just tried to keep the costs down for the devices due to lack of memory capacity. And so, the ability to add an encryption layer just doesn't exist. Often there's a desire to minimize data transport volumes, which means that things aren't encrypted necessarily by default because it adds a layer, particularly if you're using TCP/IP rather than UDP/IP. And I'm sure we'll talk more about that at other times. And then the back end is often the most vulnerable because the single point of failure is the person who actually comes in to download the data. They don't use, they don't have very good password control. They have widespread user access. That's where things get hacked into. Having said that, the dangers of poor security are huge and growing because so much critical infrastructure and corporate networks are connected via small, stupid devices at the far end, at the edge of them. They can open doors into corporate networks. You then get the option of hacking critical infrastructure, power utilities, gas networks, all of those sorts of things in theory are available to that sort of stuff. So they need very high level encryption. There's ideas around corporate sabotage, ransomware, all of those things can in theory be introduced via IoT networks that are unencrypted or insecure along the way. And then you've got individual targeting as well, where somebody can be targeted by their usage. So that security is going to become, if it isn't already, the critical reason why IoT becomes a bit on the nose in various sectors because of the opening up of access to corporate networks. So what do you do, Jeff?
Well, you design with security in mind from the ground up. So you make sure that you do careful analysis of the accessibility at every point, end to end, of your design, and secure those networks not as an afterthought, but as part of the original design. We talked about SCADA last week, Shane, and we didn't mention that the interesting history of this. The moment those sorts of large enterprises and activities, sometimes it might be nuclear power plants and the like. The moment they became accessible online, then we discovered that people were using them for espionage internationally, before it was even realized that what the limitation was there. And I reiterate your point, Shane, that because of low bandwidths, it can be difficult to engineer in a good encryption standard. So that's always a bit of a limitation. It's particularly a limitation when you're using satellite networks. So the takeaway for me is right at the beginning, before you do anything else, with the help of a specialist if you need it, engineer with security in mind.
Yes, if only people did. And I suppose the corollary to security is privacy. And privacy is, it comes at a high cost. It is a huge, big swag of ethical issues for us these days. Some say that IoT is the biggest single risk to safety and privacy, in some ways bigger than social media, for example, because at least with social media, you're consciously aware of some of the details that you're putting on the internet. With IoT data collection, it occurs under the covers and in between the cracks that you don't necessarily think about. For example, your food ordering patterns from your smart fridge might say something about you. You're a diabetic, for example, or there are other food things about it. Your driving habits and where you go each day, the way you do actually drive can can be tracked, as well as where you're going if somebody actually wants to track you. And those things are findable in many cases. For example, most cars manufactured in the last 10 years send all sorts of diagnostic and usage data back to the manufacturers of their head office. So they don't necessarily go to the dealers, but they do. Often you will turn up at the dealers and you'll say, I've got my service, to say, yes, we've been expecting you because your engine, your engine monitoring system is not going properly, and you'll be using more fuel than you should, or something like that. They started off at the high-end cars, the BMWs and the Mercedes and the like, many years ago, and it's spread to virtually all manufacturers these days. So that sort of stuff is being collected. We're not necessarily aware of it, because what will be there is some sort of innocuous clause in the car sales contract when the car is first purchased that will say, I sign away all my rights to worry about this stuff. And where does that data go? Do car companies sell it on? Almost certainly they do. They probably sell it on to insurers, for example, to get real-time data on how people drive, because that's how insurers limit their risk, by getting actual data. We also know that floating car data is purchased by Google and other people from all sorts of places. They used to actually approach individual transport companies to buy it, and taxis and the like. I think they now get a lot of it from car manufacturers as well. And that's what gives us, the great thing about it is it gives us real-time traffic data on our Google Maps. The problem about it is that, it might become identifiable at some point in the process. All of this is de-identified, but often it's not, or it can be identified because you're the only person in that particular area, or something else is going on. But it can be used in more subtle ways as well to influence you. For example, dynamic advertising on billboards that move in response to traffic delays and give you different messages depending on what's going on. Ice creams and cola on a hot day, or if there's a big accident up ahead, it might just be coincidental that a ambulance chasing lawyer is advertising at that point in the process. So the possibility of misuse and abuse of that data looms large and regularly. And in fact, the possibility of it being captured by a malware player of some sort is also huge. So, you can say that there's no problem with doing it at a population level, but doing it at an individual level is very hard to to stop that happening, or to stop it being de-identified completely. I make note of what you said the other day to me, Jeff, that we're all concerned about our privacy until we make a product that inadvertently or otherwise interferes with everybody else's privacy.
But absolutely, I teach a little bit at Melbourne Uni, just supervising some final year projects, and in those courses and in the teaching, ethical issues have become fundamental. And they get discussed every single week, the ethical implications of a particular software design, because we're overdue to face the fact that we have those ethical obligations, and we have no right to make money at the expense of infringing on somebody else's rights.
Absolutely. And the interesting thing is, and I think it's fair to say about IoT, is that there's been discussions for many years about standards, and there are some standards about various things, but standards about privacy and security, well, security probably does have standards because they use other ones, but privacy issues are becoming problematic, and more so as we go along. By the way, Josh, who's asking about how's your car communicating with the dealers, cars actually do have embedded SIMs in them. Many cars do. and they have embedded eSIMs in lots of cases, and they have for many years. It's just that it's never admitted to by the car companies. And I'm not saying that as a as some sort of conspiracy network. It's just the fact that is what happens. They do have all of that buried in there, and they do communicate back for the purposes of the manufacturers. So that's sort of come to the end of what we'd planned to talk about a little bit tonight. There's so many things we should cover in longer term, such as standards and other things. And I'm again remind you, this is a very short course on very, just providing a bit of an overview of what the IoT environment is and what can happen with it. So I would encourage you to look at other sources. We're looking at how we might produce more courses over a period of time. And the next couple of weeks, we're going to do some deep dives into edge devices, hardware, networks, and the like, and try and get around to talk a little bit more in detail about those. I see that Glenn's 5-year-old Hyundai has a sim in it. Now, we don't have very many questions. I'll see if there's any there that I've got to say, most of the questions actually we've either already answered or are probably unanswerable. For example, Ray's asked if government's half of the universe, are you aware of any IoT device for detecting corruption? Yuck, yuck, yuck. If only there was. If only lie detectors work.
Shane, Etisham raised the question of sensors on the network and licensed sensors and unlicensed sensors, and that's a good question, which we'll defer to a later session. But that question of the reliability and security of edge devices is critical. And the other thing I noticed in the chat, which is very important, is the use of sensors by Collingwood in their win in the grand final.
We made it nearly through an entire thing without you mentioning it, Jeffrey. But yes, football players have been wearing tracking devices for at least 15 years or more.
And it's fair to say that that's revolutionized the game. Most particularly because you could monitor when you needed to take players off and bring them back on again. And that's feeding into a lot of decision making and changing the game.
Absolutely.
For the better, probably.
Yes. Well, hard to know, really. Well, that's it for this evening. Thank you very much for coming along. We hope you've enjoyed tonight's webinar and found it useful and informative. As I said, for the next couple of weeks, Jeff will be primarily teaching us about technical aspects of IoT, and we'll talk a little bit more about outputs and how big data works as well. But thanks so much for spending your time with us here this evening, and we look forward to seeing you in another week. Same bat time, same bat channel. Oh, by the way, I should say thank you to Lil for managing the channel. And of course, thank you, Jeff.